Avengers Endgame lived up to its billing, bringing the 11-year-long Infinity Saga to a close, and what a close it was. One of the character sunsets we got was the ever-vigilant Captain America, who finally got his dance with Peggy. But with the confusing nature of time travel, in what reality did Cap get his dance? Today, we're going to take a look at the Captain America situation in Endgame, and trust us, it's complicated. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, time travel became the key factor in returning the Dusted and vanquishing Thanos. This left a lot of questions about timelines and consequences, like what happens in the reality Tony and Scott created when Loki escaped after the Battle of New York with the Tesseract. But one of the biggest questions revolves around Captain America's timeline. There's reason to believe that in our reality, there's always been two Captain Americas. There was an older one who lived out his retirement with the love of his life, Peggy Carter, and the one that was the earlier part of his life, being frozen in ice and then saved the world a few times. Recently, the writers of Endgame have confirmed that while there are always different viewpoints, Captain America existing side by side with himself was one that they intended. Let's look at how that happens. It starts with the rules of time travel, which, in Endgame, are definitely not based on Back to the Future, because that would be insane. There's a few explanations for the rules of time travel. When Rhodey suggests taking care of the Thanos problem, Banner and Nebula explain that time travel can't work that way. If you go into your past becomes your future. Fortunately, the Ancient One was on hand to explain some of the nuances of tripping through time. The Sorcerer Supreme didn't want to give up the Time Stone because it would have created a new timeline where Earth didn't have one of its best defenses. There also was the Space Stone in the Tesseract, but that mostly blew up and sent people to do public service on Vormir. That's when Banner promises to return the stones to their original timelines so that all the fun things will still happen with them. The Mind Stone alone creates Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Vision. Well, also Ultron. It was Captain America's job to travel back in time to put all of the stones in the right place. Hawkeye didn't appear to know who Red Skull was, which means that there was no one to give Cap a heads up that he was giving the Soul Stone back to his greatest enemy. If that was his last stop, one could only imagine it made him reflect on the choices of his life when he decides to skip his appointment in time and instead finally get that dance with Agent Peggy Carter. Back at the Avengers compound, instead of getting their Captain America back in 5 seconds, an older Steve Rogers turns up on a bench overlooking the lake. This is our biggest clue that Cap didn't create a new reality where he danced with Peggy Carter, but instead was in our reality all this time. If he had created a new reality, he would have had to skip on over from his new reality to our reality to give Sam his shield. With the release of the new Spider-Man Far From Home trailer, we know that this is a thing that can happen, but of course, we learned it from one Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio. He's been known to bend the truth about his origins, but there are other clues that point to Cap coexisting with himself. We find out in Winter Soldier that Peggy eventually married a World War II vet via some archival footage at the Smithsonian. In the interview, she tells the story of Captain America saving 1,000 men, including the man who would become her husband. There's no pictures of that man on her mantle in the present, and the reason might be because they'd look a little too familiar. Rogers isn't very specific about when he skipped out and decided to get that life that Tony kept talking about, but it doesn't appear to be the date that Carter set at the end of the first Avengers. Instead, they share a private dance at her house. There are still some moments in time to clear up though. Of course, the first is the easiest. Peggy wouldn't actually be lying per se in her story about her husband. Captain America technically saves his own life when he saves everyone else's. Once the time heist goes wrong during the Battle of New York and then Loki makes a break for it with the Tesseract, Steve and Tony call an audible on their time heist and then go back to 1970 where the Tesseract, Hank Pym, and his valuable Pym particles would be in one place. That one place is the same facility where Captain America was created and the current headquarters of S.H.I.E.L.D. It's also where the Tesseract was parked after Howard Stark retrieved it from the ocean, but before it became a part of Mar-Vell's plan to make an escape for the refugee Skrulls. Both Tony and Steve managed to run into someone from their past. For Tony, that's his father, who is expecting young Tony in a few months. Obviously, he's unable to recognize his adult, not yet born son, who gives his dad fathering advice based on raising his granddaughter. Time travel is weird. Cap finds himself hiding in the office of one Peggy Carter, director of S.H.I.E.L.D. He's separated by just a window from the love of his life and can't say anything. Something that Peggy Carter understands because neither can she. It's likely that she sees Cap in her office 3 feet away and also can't say anything because it's not yet her Steve Rogers. Her Steve Rogers already beat Thanos and slipped back through time to return the stones and then had that dance. This Steve still had to complete his mission, so she continued about her business knowing that the Captain America in the room next door was about to save the world yet again. Captain America has gone through a lot of changes since first appearing in the pages of Timely Comics before emerging from the ice in Marvel. One of the sharp changes was in the 1970s when, among all the world-saving and Avenger being, Steve Rogers set about finding himself after the death of his girlfriend, Agent 13. That's the niece of Peggy Carter, who would then also be his niece by marriage that he kissed at Peggy's funeral. Probably best to leave that one out of the retelling of Cap's adventures to Peggy. Part of Rogers' journey of discovery is to become a commercial artist. He struggles to find a job for a while before realizing that he had a front row seat to comic book adventure shenanigans with him being a superhero himself. And with that, Steve Rogers became a comic book artist at the very company that produced Captain America comic books. This would be a remarkably charming coda to the life of the MCU Steve Rogers. It'd mean that he gets to tell the stories of superheroes and help inspire an equally idealistic S.H.I.E.L.D. rookie, Phil Coulson. To remain in our timeline, he would have to also not stop the Hydra infiltration of S.H.I.E.L.D. until his past self does that in the Winter Soldier. But perhaps he'd be able to say enough to maybe keep an eye out for one agent Nick Fury Jr.? Keep an eye out? Yeah, you get it? Yeah, you get it. Of course, there's a chance that over the course of his new life with Peggy, the ever-vigilant super soldier ran across a situation that didn't sit well with his sense of right and wrong. Perhaps there were moments where Cap called up his old war buddies, the Howling Commandos, to have a good old-fashioned Captain America adventure. There are other implications as well. While Peggy's hospital bed didn't feature any pictures of her husband, they did include pictures of her 2 children. Imagine the pressure of growing up with parents who are a super spy and a superhero? It goes beyond that, however. Much of the arc of the first season of Agent Carter and some key elements of Civil War were the possession of the last surviving blood samples of Steve Rogers. That was so important because Steve Rogers was the only one to successfully take the super soldier serum. There had been plenty of attempts since then too. Luke Cage got his powers from an attempt to recreate it, and even the Hulk owes his creation to the attempt to remake super soldiers. But depending on how the serum works, he might have passed some of his super soldierness onto his children. Seeing as Peggy and Steve are part of the greatest generation, their kids would be baby boomers who would likely have kids of their own who'd be adults in the current MCU. There could be a whole family line of Rogers super soldiers running around, maybe even without knowing it, depending on how tight-lipped Peggy and Steve were about who Steve really is. One of the rumors regarding the future of the MCU has centered around the Young Avengers, which include heroes both inspired and related to the original Avengers. Their Captain America is Patriot, the descendant of another super soldier recipient, but he doesn't inherit his powers from his grandfather. While this isn't Steve Rogers' grandson, it still sets a comic book precedent for the Young Avengers flag bearer being the grandson of a Captain America. Scott Lang's daughter has already volunteered to be his sidekick, a nod to her comic book persona as Stature. Monica Rambeau appeared in Captain Marvel and was a Captain Marvel in her own right before taking the persona of Photon, her mom's call sign in the Captain Marvel movie. With the Skrulls around, hulking could be in the MCU's future. Is it possible that the writer's diplomatic statement about different people's interpretations is a nod to the fact that what they intended doesn't have a bearing on what future writers might go with in future stories? This would mean that Cap did create a new timeline where he had his dance with Peggy Carter and they got married instead of the soldier whose life Cap saved in World War II, and perhaps even told her all about Project Paperclip and then, cut off that whole Hydra thing at the pass. This would mean that Rogers wrote out his life to the same moment when the snapping, unsnapping, and resnapping happened to activate the quantum GPS device and bridge his way back into the MCU timeline to pass on his shield to Sam Wilson. Perhaps it's the rips and tears in reality that were created by Thanos and the aftermath of Thanos that make that easier. While he wasn't able to return to the time machine, he was able to connect to our Earth. If he can't return to his own timeline, it becomes functionally the same. It all depends on where the story goes, and if Endgame was any indication, there's no telling where that might be. It'll probably be cool though. That's the tale of the two Captain Americas in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so what do you think? Was the veteran that Peggy married Cap himself, or was it another reality where the dance happened? Let us know in the comments, and hey, why not subscribe to CBR while you're at it for more MCU videos? Thanks for watching.